Hello. So if you're familiar with my channel, you'll know that I seldom talk, and the reason for this is that I am not a gear expert. However, my video about this guitar, the Squier Classic Vibe 60s Jazzmaster, has gotten lots of views because I was one of the first people to post a demo of this guitar when it was released around Easter of last year in 2019. And I ended up getting a lot of questions in the comments about what my assessment of the guitar was. Again, my videos are demos. I don't usually criticize. However, I think now that it's been a year since I posted that video, I think it might be helpful to some people to get an honest review of this guitar, how it's held up over that time, how the components have held up, and what my assessment is of it as a player. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the headstock, and I'm going to move down to the body, and we're going to talk about each of the components. But generally, I would say that I find this pretty disappointing as an instrument. Cost me $460 Canadian as opposed to $400 US for this Sonic Blue model, which was on sale at the time. The price has now gone up in Canada by almost $100. It's up to $560. At the time, I remember thinking that $460 or with tax over $500 was pushing it for a Squier. It was on the edge of being overpriced. I would say at its current price in Canada and Australia and other places outside the United States, it's definitely overpriced for what you get. But anyway, let's start off at the headstock, and we'll see if you agree. As you can see, we've got this classic Fartmaster logo. We've got these slotted tuners, which I actually quite like. They lock the strings in pretty well. Mind you, I use relatively heavy gauge strings. These are D'Addario 12 to 52 thousandths half rounds. And the reason why I use half rounds is because I prefer flat one strings, but I just didn't like spending $27 to string up a Squier. So anyway, got these half rounds on it. The tuners lock the strings in quite well. They have pretty good motion. They're pretty smooth. When the guitar was new, the backs of these tuners were covered in grease. They were caked in grease. They're still a little bit greasy. It's mostly worn off. I don't know what the deal with that was. Anyway, we can see the Fender logo in the back and the serial number, crafted in Indonesia. For those of you who don't know, the serial number ICS, that means Indonesia Cortec rather. These guitars are made by the Cortec company, which is the parent company of the guitar company called Cort. For those of you who haven't encountered Cort before, they're a sort of well-established guitar and tech company. Here's a Cort tuner that's, I think, 25 years old or so. It still works. Anyway, Cort makes pretty well all the guitars that you are going to find that were manufactured in Indonesia. So that means everything from Jackson to Schecter to GNL tribute models and countless other guitar companies. Paul Reed Smith SE, the student edition ones, those are made in Indonesia. Those are all made by Cortec, along with pretty much the entire Squier line. Now, these classic vibes are not really new guitars. What they are rebadged versions with slight spec changes of the former vintage modified series of guitars, which were again made by Cortec. These are really very similar, the Jazzmasters and the Jaguars. I don't know about the other offsets. Classic Vibe Strats and Tellys used to be made in China. I don't know whether they still are. They were made in a different facility. Different story altogether. I'm just talking about the Jazzmasters and Jaguars. A couple of minor differences which we'll cover as we move down the headstock. The other thing you'll notice as we're looking at the headstock is the color of the neck. It's a maple neck, but it's got this finish on it, a gloss finish, and kind of a color to it, tint to it, kind of like a spray tan. I don't know that I care for it. It looks kind of looks kind of tacky, but it's not a big deal. And then we've got the truss rod cavity, and that works just fine. I've adjusted that quite a bit. So anyway, let's move down the neck. The neck is decent. We got sometimes a little bit of fit and finish issues. The odd problem here that were there when it was new, but that's just the way with wooden objects. They are variable. But let's move down the neck. We've got an Indian Laurel fingerboard. I don't mind the feel of it. Indian Laurel is the current preferred substitute for rosewood for import guitars from Asia. I find that it's a bit softer than rosewood, but generally the feel is okay, and you know, it's a little bit, it's not nubbly like Pau Ferro is, but it's also not as hard as Pau Ferro. So it's a different feel, but really not that different from rosewood. It's got a bit of a gray cast, which differentiates it. On the neck, we've got the first of what I think is the more serious problems with this guitar, and you can just sort of see here how easy it is to push that high E string off the edge of the fingerboard. And this is, remember, this is a 12 gauge string, 12 gauge plain steel string, and it just slides right off. So that high E string is very close to the edge of the fingerboard, and to a degree that's historically correct for Jazzmasters. But the problem is with Jazzmasters that are truly historical, there is more adjustability in the string spacing. Here there is no adjustability in the string spacing. And that's just a thing that I find annoying when I'm trying to play a solo or play along with one of my tracks. It'll slide off the board and make that pinging noise. While we're down here, you can sort of see another issue with the fretboard. This came from the factory with a lot of this sort of white gunk on it. Buffing compound, I think, is what it is. It's mostly worn off, but it's quite unsightly, and it runs up and down the fingerboard. And you could even feel it when the guitar was new. Sorry, that's my pal Pretzel raising a ruckus at the Amazon guy. He's actually a really good boy. He feels bad about the fact that he was barking. It's okay, though. Anyway, back to the Jazzmaster. But yeah, you could feel that gunk while you were playing, in addition to being able to see it, and in addition to the sliding off the board problem. It just made the guitar not a pleasure to play.
That being said, I do think this neck plate is kind of cool, right? I mean, even my Fender doesn't say Fender on the neck plate, so that's kind of nifty. It's something, right? It's not all bad news.
Moving down into the body, and we get to the parts of the guitar that are both the most satisfying and the most frustrating to me. Start here with this switch here, this toggle switch. As you can see, it's got it's got a black tip as opposed to all the other plastics which are white, and that's because it's been replaced. This toggle switch failed within 6 weeks of me bringing the guitar home. It's a relatively straightforward repair. I had this done by a professional under warranty. It would have been a $60 job though, just for the labor, but this is a Switchcraft switch now. I just feel like that's something that bespeaks poor quality components and is something that is frustrating about this instrument. The other thing I'll say, the rhythm circuit and lead circuit switch, this stuff works fine. I haven't had any trouble with noise on the electronics or anything like that. These switches, these wheels, you can sort of push them and feel them give a bit. They do sink into the body just a little bit. But these electronics are pretty much the reason why I bought this guitar. When I pre-ordered this guitar, the Fintera series hadn't been announced yet. I'm not sure if you could get a Jazzmaster with a rhythm circuit under $1,000 before the Fintera series was introduced. I've still yet to try a Fintera one. But that was the reason why I bought it, and that was why I thought it might have been a good deal, along with all the promotion of this guitar as like the internet's favorite guitar. And that's where some of the frustration of dealing with it has come in. Anyway, down to the pickups. These pickups are, there's speculation online that they are made by Roswell, which is a company that supplies pickups for Harley Benton, among others. And I'm not sure where they're made. I think China, and I'm not sure even if Roswell makes them. I think they're very, very similar to the pickups that were in the vintage modifieds that were branded Duncan designed. They sound awesome, actually. They have that exact 60s surf sound that you're probably looking for if you're interested in this guitar. Particularly in the middle position. That's the most useful position I find when your guitar is in the lead circuit. I find that when you're in the lead circuit, the neck position and the bridge position are both so noisy that you're probably going to be disinclined to play that way if you're a bedroom player like I am. But the middle position is hum canceling, so that sounds great, and it's also just like, it's that surf style. We move down to the bridge, though. We find this is a new spec for the Classic Vibe series, and it's different from the vintage modifieds, and it's different from the Vinteras. On true historically correct Jazzmasters and Jaguars, these bridges have a lot of tiny little ridges in the saddles so that you can move the strings around and reposition them to get that high E string off the edge of the bridge. So you can adjust the string spacing. You can't do that with these. You're stuck with the one sort of middle of the road position. And that, to me, it introduces the problem of not being able to adjust the string spacing, and it doesn't solve the problem that a lot of people complain about, which is that you can just easily knock these strings out of the saddles. And indeed, you can. You can knock them all out of the saddle with not much physical effort. I play with a relatively light touch most of the time, but those of you who are really going at it are probably going to still notice this problem. This new bridge does not solve the problem of historically correct Jazzmasters. I'm just cutting in a day later to say, well, you might notice that I've got a E string missing here, and I'll get to that presently. But continuing to talk about this bridge and how it introduces problems without solving them. And one thing that I want to mention is, again, you're going to you get a little Allen key with this guitar. You're going to constantly be raising up the bridge because it will sink, just as all Jazzmasters with relatively historical construction do. The bridge will sink down after every 20 minutes of play or so, unless you got it cranked all the way up, and then you get a good break angle over this bridge, although the playing action will be a little bit stiff. But if you don't have it cranked all the way up, then just the action of playing is going to drive that bridge down. So the advent of this Mustang bridge, or this modified Mustang bridge in the Classic Vibe Jazzmaster, doesn't actually solve that endlessly complained about problem of playing Jazzmasters. And one other thing that this new bridge takes away that the vintage modified bridges had was the option to individually adjust the height of the saddles or adjust the tilt of each saddle. You can't do that anymore, so that's a problem for those of you who like to tinker. I also find that I sometimes have a bit of trouble getting strings intonated. They have quite a bit of range, these saddles do, but sometimes it feels like one or two strings, there might not be enough range, or if you overshoot it, I'm not sure. But that's been another area where this would be more frustrating than, for instance, a two-pneumatic bridge like you'd find in the American Performer series, or on a Les Paul or something like that, although I have my issues with Les Pauls too. As for the Vibrato Tailpiece, I actually think it works pretty well. I'm partial to the Jazzmaster Jaguar Vibrato. It stays in tune pretty well, actually. and it operates similar to a Bigsby, although it has this nice long arm, which you won't get on a Strat type guitar. That is sort of part of the special sauce of a Jazzmaster, characteristic of its sound, characteristic of its playability. Like a Bigsby, it stays in tune really quite well. It just has to be set up. They expect to be set up with fairly heavy strings. Historically correct Jazzmasters and Jaguars don't perform well with strings lighter than about 11s. And that's just a fact. That's the way that they're engineered. If you want to use lighter strings, you probably shouldn't be trying to make them work on a more historical type model like this one. You probably want one of the more modern offsets with humbuckers, for example. So generally this tailpiece operates as I expect it, but I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to show you. Notice how the windings on that high E string are not there, as opposed to the B string. And the reason for that is that I've had to rewind that E string by hand. I always have to do this. It's because of that screw there, the raised screw. When you operate the vibrato, it rubs that E string against that screw and it undoes the windings. So you're going to blast through a lot of high E strings before you figure out how to fix that problem. One idea that I've had is to just take out that screw and replace it with a flathead, but I haven't done that yet. But yeah, you're going to go through a lot of these things. Even if you use the special soldered strings, you're just going to blast through them. I've blasted through so many strings. I haven't broken a string since 2007, until I got this guitar, and then I break tons of strings. That's why I've switched to a cheaper type of string than I usually use. I usually use heavier strings than most players do. As I said, these are 12s. They're tuned to standard pitch. Yeah. I'm not used to going through strings at this kind of rate. While we're talking about the Vibrato Tailpiece, I want to just show you something here. You hear that? That's the whammy bar clattering against the collar that it sits in. Of course, it's a drop-in style, and yeah, it's quite noisy. That, I think, is a reflection of just how well the components of this guitar are fitted together. I don't know how historical this is, but, you know, that there's not a lot of fit there. And you'll hear that noise all the time. When you give the guitar a shake, you can hear that. And my wife makes fun of me endlessly about this guitar because of how clickety-clackety it is. And again, as I said, I think that just reflects how complete it is, how well fitted together the components are. We've also got these knobs, and they're fine. As I said, the pots are okay. They do what they need to do. I usually have the tone set about halfway down. The knobs came from the factory installed at an angle, so they didn't actually travel correctly. Anyway, that was a pretty simple fix, even for somebody who is not a gear expert like myself. Overall, I want to speak about the experience of playing this guitar. And I think ultimately what you get with this guitar is a lot more like what you get with other Squiers than what you would get with a higher end guitar. Or, to put it a different way, it's a lot like what you get with other kinds of Cortec builds. If you get a guitar that's made in Indonesia, it was probably made by Cortec. The only possible exception, you can see this bass next to it, which costs half as much. This is a Yamaha bass, and I've been told that Yamaha does their own manufacturing. I'm not sure, but they also manufacture in Indonesia. But man, what a difference. This Yamaha costs about $200 US, and I've had it the same length of time, and it's been completely trouble-free. The fretboard is much nicer, much smoother. The frets are much nicer. nicer. They're not gritty. The fret ends are actually pretty well dressed, which I can't really say for this Jazzmaster. Now, I'm not complaining about fret sprout. Yeah, sure, there's been a little bit of that, but that's going to happen on this type of guitar, where you're going to get fret ends. Actually, I think it was on this side. It was the 12th fret. You're going to get frets that erupt through the lacquer a little bit, just if you live in a place that has a variable climate, as I do. And that doesn't bother me. What bothers me is that you can feel the sort of not the tangs, but the sort of teeth at the end of the fret. You can actually feel the teeth at the end of the fret sort of catching you as you run up and down. And that's just a thing that somebody working with a file for an extra few minutes could deal with very readily. And that's typical of these kinds of imported guitars, really, no matter how much you pay for them. So, overall, I would say that the one myth that I want to dispel is this idea that you pay a tax, like an unreasonable tax, to get Fender on the headstock. And you can see the gig bag from my Fender Electric 12 in the back, which is the first Fender I've ever owned. I've played a couple of others too. No, you don't pay a tax to get Fender on the headstock. These Cortec-made Squiers, they don't compare to a Mexican Fender. They just don't. They don't feel as substantial. They don't feel as put together. The fretwork isn't as good, and the components aren't as good quality. And I wish that somebody had been honest with me about that, because otherwise I would have gone into buying this guitar thinking, okay, it's a Squier. I know what I'm expecting when I buy a Squier. One thing I shouldn't have been expecting was that I'm going to get performance that's on par with a made-in-Mexico Fender, because you're just not getting that. Whether you find the experience of playing this guitar frustrating, as I do, that'll depend on your playing style, what you expect of it, what you use it for. Whether it's worth what you pay for it, maybe that depends on whether you're in the States or whether you're in some other country. I will say that if you're playing for an audience, it sounds great. I can really endorse these pickups, particularly in the middle position. I don't know how pleased I am or how inclined I am to play in that bridge position. But if you come to your Jazzmaster like I do, wanting to make surf-type music, play like the Ventures, play like Carl Wilson, or if you come into it through wanting to play like Tom Verlaine, I think the Tom Verlaine style is just like you pop it in the neck position and you turn up the gain a bit, and then you wiggle a lot during your solo. But yeah, big Tom Verlaine fan, and that's how I got to this guitar, wanting to play like Tom Verlaine. Are you going to be able to do that? Well, you'll sound pretty good with this guitar. Are you going to have fun doing it? I'm not sure, but I've found it more frustrating than I have satisfying. I also think, as a side note, that it hasn't aged very well. Obviously, with COVID, I'm not going up playing gigs, but I wouldn't have done that anyway. As I said, I'm strictly a bedroom player. I play for myself and friends and family once in a while. This guitar has not been ridden hard, but I don't know. Look at how grungy that chrome looks. I just feel like it shows an excessive amount of wear, and the pickguard looks like that too. I don't play my guitars hard, but it's gotten, I think, excessively worn for just over a year of play for, a few minutes a day. Anyway, that's my assessment of the Squier Classic Vibe 60s Jazzmaster in Sonic Blue. I hope this was useful. I'm sorry it went on so long. I know you guys are used to my videos being shorter. Please let me know if you have any other questions, and I'll endeavor to answer them. Otherwise, thank you for clicking, and thank you for watching my other videos.